Hello, everyone. Today we'll be doing an interview with Jeremy Skrzypek. Jeremy has written a bunch of the topic on personal identity. And for those of you who don't know what personal identity is, it's basically a branch in philosophy which concerns with what makes you you and what makes you the same thing you were yesterday as you are now. Dr. Jeremy, would you please be willing to introduce yourself for the audience?
Yes, hello. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Dr. Jeremy Skrzypek. I'm assistant professor of philosophy at Ohio Dominican University in Columbus, Ohio, USA. I work in the areas of metaphysics and medieval philosophy and the philosophy of religion. More specifically, I work on issues related to material composition, persistence over time, the nature of time, and the nature of persons. Even more specifically than that, I work on issues surrounding the Aristotelian theory of hylomorphism. On the medieval side, I've been trying to unpack what St. Thomas Aquinas' views on form and matter really are and what they entail for his larger system. And in the contemporary debates, as renewed interest in Aristotelian approaches in metaphysics has come about, I've been looking into, well, as a contemporary theory of material objects and as persons, right? What can hylomorphism offer? What sort of puzzles can it solve? Why might it be a better view than some of the other ones currently on offer?
Okay, that is perfect actually. Why don't we start with first introducing everyone to the most popular, most prominent versions of the theories of personal identity. I know you got a bunch of those ready, so I think that will be a perfect start.
Sure. Yeah. I like to think of the metaphysics of the human person or the ontology of the human person as an attempt to answer two main questions. One, what are we? And two, in what does our identity consist? So the first sort of question is like the synchronic question of just getting the category right. What is the thing that we are? How are we different from other things? What sort of things are we most like? It also involves sort of like where are your spatial boundaries? How do we individuate you from other things, from even other things within your kind? The in what does our identity consist question is about the diachronically your identity, about what makes you the same over time, what makes you the same person, right? What makes you the same person as the person that's in the childhood photo back at your mom's place? What makes you the same person as 5 minutes ago? And in the contemporary debate on the ontology of the human person, there are three general approaches to trying to answer these questions. There are psychological approaches, there are what we might call somatic or bodily approaches, and there are further fact approaches. So psychological approaches generally will say that what we are has most to do with our mind or with our consciousness, that we are like essentially self-conscious beings and that we persist over time. So then what does our identity consist? In some kind of psychological continuity. So maybe it's about the causal connection between certain mental states, or maybe it's that you retain certain mental states throughout the course of your existence, or if not particular mental states, then like psychological capacities. Somatic or bodily approaches will focus more, for answering both of those questions, on the body. So let's say that getting at what you are, right, we should focus more on sort of like the brute physical elements of your body. And within the somatic or bodily approaches, you get those who focus on just sort of the kind of physical continuity between your material parts. And there are others that focus more on the life processes in that matter. So the latter would be like animalism. On the further fact approach is most generally just the approach that says that there is more to what you are and in what your identity consists over time than just the psychological and the biological facts can tell us. And the most common further fact that is proposed for what makes you what you are and the particular individual you are is to introduce something like an immaterial or non-physical soul. So further fact theorists will say that there's a deeper story for what you are beyond or underneath or above, sort of like the biological and the psychological facts. And so the psychological and biological facts might serve as like evidence for when, or for useful strategies for tracking individuals' identity over time, but there's a deeper story for what actually makes you what you are and what makes you the same over time. And within further fact theories, within soul theories, you've got two major camps there. You've got substance dualists, championed by classically by philosophers such as Plato and Descartes, and more recently Richard Swinburne. And you've got hylomorphism, championed by classically philosophers such as Aristotle and many medieval philosophers such as St. Thomas Aquinas, and contemporary philosophers such as some of the folks that you've interviewed, Rob Koons, Bill Jaworski, and I've been working on this project myself. Also folks such as David Oderberg, Eleanor Stump. So I think that's sort of the large lay of the land. You've got these three major approaches. When we're looking to answer the questions, what are we and what does our identity consist? Do we focus more on the mind? Do we focus more on the body? Or should we bring in this other thing, right? Some kind of soul, some sort of immaterial component to the human person to answer those questions.
Okay, that was a perfect summary of all the views. So when it comes to personal identity and the views you mentioned, what are some of the problems with the views that you obviously don't hold?
Yeah, good. So, I mean, here's the bigger question, like, how do we figure out which of these approaches is on the right track? What's the method for determining which views are right and which ones are wrong? Well, just like in a lot of things in metaphysics, I think we have a couple of tools or resources at our disposal. So the first thing that we're looking for in a theory of the human person is, well, maybe not the first in order, but one of the things we should definitely be looking for in a theory of the human person as a theory about anything about the world or ourselves, is we should be thinking about what we know about ourselves from the empirical sciences. The empirical sciences are not going to settle these questions, but a good theory of the human person, right, ought to be consistent, and not only consistent, sort of ought to sort of explain, right, or be able to sort of give a deeper theory for why sort of these, why this empirical data is the way that it is. So we're looking for consistency and a theory that illuminates, right, the data that we have from the empirical sciences. We're also looking for a theory, of course, we're using our logical tools. We want a theory that's internally consistent, right, that sort of has good inferences, right, between its claims, right, that holds together well. And finally, we're looking for a theory of the human person. The other resource that we have, right, is we are human persons, so we have the resources of our own experience. So a good theory of the human person ought to be consistent with and ought to help us better understand or illuminate our own experience as human persons. So it ought to sort of line up with how things seem to us from the inside, how sort of human persons that we know seem to be. Now, that a theory doesn't line up exactly with how things seem to be doesn't mean that it has to be discounted outright. But really, sort of, if we're looking for the best theory would be one that would be consistent with and sort of helps to explain the data that we have from the empirical sciences. One that sort of is internally consistent and has sort of clear and consistent steps between its claims, and one that is consistent with and illuminates sort of our own experience as human persons. So with that said, right, a lot of the debate on the nature of the human person comes down to thought experiments. A lot of it has to do with thought experiments, because the thought experiments, when we imagine sort of a case and we look to see what our reaction is to the case, what we're examining here is whether the theory really lines up with our own experience, with our own intuitions about our own thoughts about what human persons are like and what sort of situations we could survive. So, for example, one of the main thought experiments that's been operating in the identity on the intelligent persons for quite a while is something like a brain transplant. So, for example, imagine, right, perhaps we're getting closer to the actual sort of physical possibility of being able to, right, extract your brain from your body and, right, relocate it and hook it up and get it to take, right, in another human body. Now, as I said, it's, as of right now, not a thing that happens as far as I know, right? But in some ways, it's a good thought experiment because we've reason to believe that it could be on the horizon, right? This does seem like sort of technologically looked like it could in principle happen. So but what would happen to the person in that case, right? Would the individual go with his or her transplanted brain, or would they just lose the main organ that they have, right, for doing lots of things? And so would they be left behind in sort of the body that doesn't have the brain? So bodily, most people have the reaction, right? I find this when I'm teaching, when I'm talking to lots of people. Most people have the reaction that, I think if you move the brain, right, and it's sort of still functioning throughout, sort of it carries like a lot of my psychological states and memories and my personality, my virtues, and my vices, right? It's going to carry that with it, and it's going to sort of like the person who wakes up in the other body is going to have all those things about me. Most people have the reaction that that's going to be me. I'm going to wake up in the other body. It'd be very strange, very disorienting to be waking up in a different body. But most people have the reaction, right? Most people sort of think that that stuff seems closer, right, to my essence, right? The really important things about my identity. Now, if that's right, then that could be a count against more bodily approaches that say that maybe you sort of it's more about the rest of the body or more about where most of the body is. And so that could be a worry for bodily approaches that most of us have the reaction. It seems strongly to us that that brain would carry our identity. Now, it depends, right? It depends on different sort of bodily approaches will disagree on how much of the body or what part of the body is sort of most important for your identity. But these sorts of brain transplants are often sort of wielded as like showing the inconsistency of a view or the cost of a view, right? That it doesn't accord with our reactions to these sorts of cases. But it gets complicated, right? Immediately, you might think, okay, right, okay, I go with my brain. So any view that says that I don't, right, that's the view that doesn't line up sort of with my own thoughts, my own intuitions, perhaps even my own sort of experience. But it gets complicated if we imagine, like, okay, this is sort of like the more complicated brain transplant case is, well, what if we took, right, your brain, right, and we split it in two? So we have lots of actual patients, right, that have survived through some sort of injury, right, with just half a brain. They lose the ability to do some things. Doing some things becomes more difficult, but we have actual real patients that have survived with sort of only sort of half of a functioning brain. And indeed, we have patients, it seems, right, that could survive with either half. There's not one half in a way that's more important. So now we think about the brain transplant case in light of that observation. Well, if you could survive with half a brain, and if you would go with your brain if we transplanted it to a different body, well, what if we took each half and put them in a different body? And now we've got a very pesky problem, because at first it seemed like we were inclined to say that I go with my brain. But if it also seems true that I could survive with only half a brain, what happens when we transplant both halves to a different body? Now, right, our intuitions are a little bit unclear. It seems like we want to say, well, gosh, they both halves would have enough to be me, but they can't both be me. And sort of, if we imagine sort of that each one has just as much of you as the other, it seems hard to say that one of them is you rather than the other. But it also seems wrong to say, okay, because both of them have just as much of me, maybe neither one of them is me. That seems like the wrong answer too. And so this double transplant case, or it's more generally sort of a fission case, where one thing sort of splits into sort of two even or two symmetrical offshoots, is a puzzle, I think, for lots of different theories of the human person. And it gets us really to think hard about our reaction initially that we would go with our brain.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, I think Derek Parfit was he the first one who introduced everyone to the brain fission cases as far as the problems they can carry?
Certainly, he's the one for bringing it to everyone's attention, right? He's the one in his Reasons and Persons who introduces these sort of puzzling cases, right? We had brain transplants being talked about before that, right? But he's the one who sort of came up with this sort of case where if we were to split the brain in two, then what would happen? And he's
And
the one to
yeah,
rightly point out how tricky it's going to be.
yeah, and I'm pretty sure that his conclusion in the end was, well, we shouldn't care about the Yeah,
Yeah,
even what we are, we should just care about the psychological continuity of
yeah,
this.
yeah. His conclusion was, right, well, it might turn out, right, that maybe one of them, maybe neither one of them is actually you, either the halves that were transplanted. It might turn out, right, that neither one. It might be that sort of splitting your brain like that and putting it into two means, in a way, strictly speaking, that your identity has ceased. But he said, how much does that really matter? Each offshoot is going to carry on enough of your personality to accomplish all the goals that you had, to take care of your loved ones, right, in the way that you would, right? So how bad is that really? Parfit famously says that we shouldn't think of that nearly as bad as death, even though strictly speaking, he thinks they can't both sort of have your numeric identity, and maybe neither one of them does.
Yeah, it's certainly a very tricky conclusion. So I'm wondering now whether the what would be the responses from the various views to that specific question, because it seems tricky under every single one of the views.
Mhm. Yes. Yeah, it's going to be tricky under. I think ultimately there are going to be fission cases or possible cases in which we could sort of double up. We could take everything that the view says that's required or enough to be you and actually sort of double it up. So there are two things, right? Two, your sort of identity, what they said your identity consists in, continues on in two offshoots at the same time. And originally, these cases were introduced as a puzzle for psychological approaches, because maybe why we're inclined to think that we go with our brains is because it's carrying all of that psychology. So maybe, right, one of the reactions is, oh, well, that's what's misleading about the psychological approach. You shouldn't think that you go where your psychology goes, because what the double transplant case shows us is that at least one of the offshoots, they can't both be you. So at least one of the offshoots has enough of your psychology to be you and isn't. Right. So that shows us that you are not your psychology. Right. So some people think that this is sort of this is reason to reject psychological approach. I think it is that. Right. I think it's even more than that. So you might think, well, if you don't say that you go with your brain, right, maybe you say that you're still behind with your body, right? Maybe you get around fission cases. So maybe sort of like bodily approaches, maybe even animalism would say, right, that if you just take sort of like the part of your brain that carries your psychology, no, you've left the animal, you've left the body, you've left the person behind. And so maybe, right, maybe the bodily and specifically maybe the biological approaches would say that, okay, good, this fission case, right, is grist for our mill. It's going to give further reason for why we should reject psychological accounts. Derek Parfit, right, who accepts something like a psychological approach to the human person, thinks that's reason to doubt that what we really care about in assessing what we are and what identity, what we really care about is numerical identity. He thinks really what we care about, right, are the continuation of sort of these aspects of our personality, our character, our memories, our the ability for our projects to be completed and our loved ones taken care of. I guess on the psychological approach, some will also build in like a non-splitting condition, right? Your psychology keeps you going unless you split it. There's worries about that sort of being ad hoc, all right? About sort of like, well, you can't just sort of stipulate that sort of case.
Yeah, that was actually something I was about to say.
Yeah,
It seems as though they just want to abandon all these problems and say, okay, well, sure, we don't know the answer, but really what we care about is this. But okay, so what? Even if we do care about it, doesn't seem that that's really
yeah,
the answer to
yeah,
all the problems we just put out.
mm, yeah. Yes. So I think that bodily or biological counts are still going to have versions of this problem, because it still seems like there are cases, even if it doesn't involve the brain, in which you can kind of split an animal, or you could split your body into two, and sort of both offshoots would have enough, right, to carry on your identity. But once again, they can't both be you. So what do we do about this case, right? So there are possible biological fission cases, right? So you can imagine, right, in sort of simpler creatures like an amoeba can divide, right? And we've got two afterwards, but okay, what happened to the original, right? We have something similar to that happening very on in human development for the case of monozygotic twinning. What we've got is sort of like a single zygote that its life processes, it seems, are continued on after it splits into two. And I think there might be other cases in which you could get that for a biological approach as well. So I think you might be able to if the brainstem is like the part of the brain that's most important for coordinating the life functions, some animalists have said that this is sort of like the real core of the animal is the brainstem. Well, couldn't you also, at least in principle, maybe split that down the middle, right? And maybe half of the brainstem goes here, half the brainstem here. It's an interesting question whether a human animal could survive with only half of its brainstem. If that's even possible, then we could have a fission case that involves not just the psychological part of the brain, but the one that's more important for the biological aspects. So I think these fission cases are going to be a problem for just about everybody. Just about everybody, right? Because and I'm inspired by Richard Swinburne here. He has a sort of similar argument. He thinks that maybe the only way to get around these fission cases, if it's true that all these other biological and psychological approaches, if they both face possibility of doubling up, that what they say makes you could continue on in two branches at the same time, and then we got those puzzles. Well, the worry comes from the assumption that both halves would have sort of like an equal amount, right? There's sort of like there's a tie, right? Each one has just as much of what makes you. And so really, right, if you wanted to survive as one rather than the other, because saying both doesn't seem right, and it also seems wrong to say that neither one of them is you. It seems like you want one of them to be you, but only one. It seems like the only way you can get the tiebreaker is if there is more to your identity than just biology and psychology. So the move, right, is to say that, well, that's one of the reasons why we need a further fact. There has to be something deeper to what makes the human person, the particular human person that he or she is. So in a fission case, right, if you have a further fact, and if the further fact is the sort of thing like a soul that can't be split or can't be sort of doubled up, it's sort of its soul, like, well, all of it's here or all of it's there, then you'll have a kind of tiebreaker. There could be a fact in the world that could make one of the offshoots you rather than the other, which would solve the problem of fission. Because souls are pesky buggers, right? They're very difficult to track down, and certainly if they exist, they're not the sort of things that you can sort of directly observe. We might not be able to tell from the outside which of the offshoots carried the original person's identity, but there still would be a fact of the matter, right? We still wouldn't have to say, right, that it's got to be sort of weirdly both or neither, right? If you introduce a further fact, it gives you sort of the metaphysical framework by which to say that, well, it's possible, right, that one of them is the original and one isn't. Even though they have sort of equal biology, equal psychology, there's a further fact, and if that further fact can't be split or doubled up, then it's at most in one of those places. So I think that's one of my favorite arguments for thinking that there's got to be more to our identity than just the biological and psychological facts, because you can design these fission cases for those types of views. And it seems to me, right, that the only way to get the tiebreaker is to have this other thing that can break the tie.
Yeah, so you did mention the can the human animal or whatever animal can survive without the brainstem. I think one of the I think a philosopher and a biologist, I forgot her name at this point. It was Maureen Kodnick. She wrote extensively on the brain death topic, well, whether an animal truly survives the kind of the standard notion of brain death. Is it just the permanent cessation of all brain function, or is it the remains of the brainstem, or and just kind of looking, is there still an animal present, or have they really just left us with all these kind of parts that do work, but not really for the benefit of the whole? So there isn't really an animal there. So I guess the animalist can sort of, as Eric Carlson does, can just accept, well, yeah, we do have an animal like right there. They're just sort of done for in this case.
Yeah. So if you go towards animalism, right, if you like the view, right, that that you are sort of a human animal, and if you like sort of the stronger version of animalism that says, and your identity consists in like these biological connections, the continuity of your life, yeah, then there's really interesting debates about, yeah, when can we say that a human animal is still alive? If we sort of divide the parts of the human animal, where can we say that that human animal goes? So as you pointed out, right, there are debates about if you moved, is the brainstem sort of like the key? Is it like the master organ for coordinating the life processes of an animal? And so if you were to move it, would the animal go with it? So Eric Olson at one point said that's what animalists should say, is they should say that if you move the brainstem, whatever, even though the body's sort of left behind, you've moved the control center for the life processes, and so that actually you've moved the animal sort of almost paradoxically from one body to another. Whereas there are other sort of observations. Neuroscientist Dr. Alan Schumann has got sort of some cases, right, in which he thinks we've clearly got a living human animal even after brainstem functionality has ceased. And indeed, as others have pointed out, it seems like, right, sort of at the fetal stage of development, before there's something like a brainstem, it looks like we've got sort of the sufficient coordination of the life processes for there to be a living human organism there. And so those raise doubts about just how important the brainstem is. Some of this, as I said, right, is an empirical question, right? What sort of cases? We have to look at the cases carefully and sort of think about, like, okay, is this a case, right? Does this show that a living human organism can survive without or before a functioning brainstem? That's gonna determine a little bit on what they say about these brain transplant cases. It's going to determine what they say about the moment of death. And I also think it's going to determine, right, to what extent, right, animalism is susceptible to these sorts of fission cases.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I wanted to bring up about is there's also another type of response. You mentioned there's a coordination happening before the brainstem is there, during the fetal development, and I believe that people like Jeff McMahon, who endorses his view of embodied minds,
Mm-hmm.
well, in this case, he just says, "Yeah, sure, there is a coordination, but since there is not a brain, as there's not, I think he believes the embodied mind is sort of the upper brain,
Mm-hmm.
the part that kind of produces the conscious experience.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was never an embryo since
Yeah.
there was never the upper brain there at
Mm-hmm.
all. So I truly began to exist at the point of the formation of the brain that is capable, has the capacity to produce the conscious experience." And that seems to be a very prominent view even today in some of abortion debates that are
Mm-hmm.
happening.
Mm-hmm.
You're probably not aware, but there's a lot of abortion debates happening at this moment. Trent Horn has debated recently this popular guy named Destiny, and they're not really super informed about these topics, but for example, he brought up the arguments regarding sort of like Jeff McMahon's view.
Mm-hmm.
So how would he have to face the problems we just outlined?
Good. So the nice thing that you've really brought in, right, is one of the ways in which you can see sort of strong divergence between theories of the human person is in answering the question, when do we begin to exist? Right? When is the sort of thing that I am first on the scene? Right? For biological approaches, the answer has to do with, well, where and when is there first a living human organism there? And so animalists and those who like the biological approach have debates about exactly when there's the living human organism there. Right, some will hold right from the beginning, right at conception. Some will hold maybe sometime later, day 14 to 16, which is not just random. There's an important reason why they think sort of that day.
Yeah, they just say that human animals can clone, and if we can clone, then surely we couldn't even clone at that
yeah,
point. So that's probably
So,
not
so
us.
the significance about 14 to 16, day 14 to 16,
Yeah.
or maybe I've seen sometimes sort of day 21, has to do with the possibility of the embryo or the zygote, if it's very early on, of splitting. This is the monozygotic twinning thing, right? The basic argument is, well, look, if whatever's there before day 14, 16 actually could become two, isn't that reason to think that it isn't sort of unified enough, right? It isn't sort of a singular individual yet. It's sort of still developing, and it's still undetermined whether it's going to be one or two. So there are debates about that. But in most cases, those who accept the biological approach are going to say that we began to exist earlier than most psychological approaches are going to say. Because for psychological approaches, they're going to say when we begin to exist, well, depends on what are sort of the key mental states or capacities that are determinative of our identity, and when are those first on the scene? So John Locke famously had a memory account of personal identity. He said, you only exist as far back as your earliest memory. Right. So when do we begin to exist? Right. For those of us with poor memory, right, it might have been just a couple weeks ago. Right. Or if sort of like maybe early on, maybe the earliest that you could sort of have long-term memories is, I don't know, like 3 or 4 years old or something like that. Other psychological approaches will not emphasize so much on memories. They'll just say, well, we just got to tie it back to the first sort of introduction or onset of consciousness or self-consciousness, or just sort of like you need to at least have the organ on the scene that is capable of supporting self-consciousness. So this is Jeff McMahon, who holds a kind of psychological approach where he thinks, right, the important thing is about the capacity for self-consciousness, or the capacity for sentience. And so as soon as there's the organ on the scene, right, that is capable of producing consciousness, that's when you begin to exist, but not earlier, because he thinks that what makes you the person you are is this capacity for self-consciousness. So before that's there, not you. Now, there might have been a human animal there before, but according to these psychological approaches, you aren't actually the animal. You have another kind of relationship to the animal, sort of short of just the equal sign, short of identity. So Jeff McMahon, for instance, seemed to think that we are like the functioning part of our higher brains, the part of our brains that's really responsible for it, that carries the capacity for higher thought and for consciousness. So prior to the introduction of that part of the higher brain, you don't exist yet. Now, as you pointed out, right, this is going to have some bearing on sort of ethical issues at the beginning of life. I think it would be too strong to say that the metaphysics is going to determine the ethics here. Right. It seems perfectly consistent, I think, right, for someone to say that I existed, let's say, very early on. You could even admit that I existed at the moment of conception, but you could still hold a view, right? Even though it was me, I don't think that I have like a central moral value. Like there are stages of my life in which I don't think I sort of had any sort of right to life, or I don't think it would have been wrong for anything to end my life. And it also seems perfectly consistent to me to say that, okay, maybe I didn't exist at conception, but there still might be some other reason for sort of terminating the entity before me, because you're like preventing, right, a person from coming to existence, or you're destroying like a potential person. You're destroying the potential of me, or something like that. But you can also see, right, how like if you really do hold a view that's going to say that you existed early on, you could see how that could be an important premise in arguing sort of against terminating that thing. If you do sort of have sort of the general moral principle that whenever I exist, it would be wrong for someone to end my life, right? Then you could see how the metaphysics would be playing a very important role in your argument. Or on the flip side, right? If it's sort of like, well, you think, well, only persons, only the things that we are, is it wrong to kill? And so if this thing isn't the same sort of thing as us, then, right, maybe you argue that there's no compelling reason sort of why we can't end its life in certain cases. So I don't think the metaphysics is going to settle the issue, but you can definitely see how it'd be a really key premise in an argument either way.
Yeah, and McMahon sees all this and says, "Well, I still believe that that is the case, and that's why he supports the abortion for some other reason. He kind of like the similar Don Marquis style future like ours, except from the moment of the creation of the upper brain. But he gives sort of an argument that's kind of been in the backbone of all the literature, hasn't been addressed that much." Is the argument from the conjoined twins, where
Mm.
and especially the cases of this as conjoined twinning. So the regular conjoined twinning is that the sort of the monozygotic twins mess up in the moment of splitting, and
Mm-hmm.
they become connected through with some body parts so with the other twin, and then you sort of get like this fusion. And it seems to us, at least, that well, in cases where there at least like an organ or some other body part is connected, it seems that, well, there's still two animals there. They're just sort of connected at this very small point. But in the cases of dicephalous twins, or another case I'm going to mention briefly, they're connected with their entire body except for their heads. And he says, okay, well, if they are just connected in pretty much everywhere else but their heads, and we still believe, well, there are two persons but one animal there, then we should really adopt his view rather than an animal's position.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's a really cool argument. Because as McMahon and Tim Campbell, who have the sort of the key article making this argument, is that it actually doesn't actually rely on thought experiments, which a lot of the personal identity literature is dependent on, right? There are real life cases of conjoined twins. So in the dicephalous case, right, we have very close to this in the famous case of the Hensel twins, Abby and Brittany Hensel. And so it's a nice argument because with just the general idea. So according to animalism, we persons are living human organisms. And so what that means is that for every one of us, there has to be sort of a different animal. And I mean, they should line up one to one. But some of these conjoined twin cases challenge the one-to-one correspondence between persons and animals. As you said, sort of in the dicephalous case, right? We've got, right, they're so conjoined, right, that it's plausible to suppose, right, that there's like just one sort of set of life processes. Now, the one set of life processes, if that's true, one animal, right, are supporting two spheres of consciousness, sort of two personalities, two sort of sets of, it seems like two intellects and two wills, right? And so we've got a challenge here because animalism says, well, look, every person is a human animal. But here we go, we got one human animal, but two persons. So what do we say about that, right? Animals have a couple different responses to the argument, but I do want to emphasize it's a nice argument. Animals have a couple responses. They could, in a way, sort of just bite the bullet, as some have, and say that, well, look, actually, yeah, it's one animal. So even though it seems like two persons there, it's really just one person with a divided consciousness. Now, I think that's a tough way to go. Sort of telling sort of Abby and Brittany to their faces, right, that you are just sort of one, right? Seems like the wrong answer, right? Though maybe they're not a true dicephalous case. They do have some separate organs sort of below their neck. So maybe that's not sort of fair. The other ways you can go, right, is you can say, right, that what we've got are like overlapping organisms, right? We do have two organisms which are sharing a whole lot of their parts, but they do have some distinct parts. I'm worried about sort of that route too, because I'm not sure that we should say that organisms can actually share parts. So Peter Van Wagen makes the claim in his Material Beings. He's a kind of animalist. He argues that lives are jealous. In other words, like the life of an organism, right, in a way sort of like takes hold of the material parts of that organism. It's almost like you can't serve two masters, right? So the idea is if a particle is caught up in one life, right, it can't be caught up in another one because it would sort of be like serving two purposes. It's sort of like, well, who is it sort of really trying to save here? So I'm hesitant about the first route of saying that there's just one animal there and having to say to those persons that really you're just one divided consciousness, just one person. I'm hesitant to say that we've got overlapping organisms. So what's left? Here's my the approach that I like to understanding conjoined twins. I think what I'd like to say, right, and I'd be interested to see whether sort of like the empirical details line up. I think some of them do. I think what we should say is that in a case of dicephalous twins, right, so we've got like one full set of organs, but we're sort of below the neck, but we've got two necks and sort of two brains. What I think we should say is that we do have two animals there. We have one animal with the full repertoire of organs, right? So you've got one animal that has sort of like the full organ set that a normal living human organism does. And I think the second animal just has whatever organs are extra. Now that means that the other animal doesn't have enough organs in a way to keep on existing on its own. And so what I like to sort of describe it as is like the one twin is actually in a way on life support from the other. It has an incomplete set of organs and couldn't survive on its own, but it's just like, right, sort of a living human organism might be attached to, you know, various external technologies at the hospital that are sort of keeping it going, keeping its life process going. I think this is sort of like a biological life support, right, that the one twin is dependent on the other. Now, how do we know sort of which twin owns the full repertoire of organs and sort of which one is the smaller one that only has the extra parts? That's going to be tricky to determine empirically. I think one of the ways in which we could, in principle, determine it is if we were to see the process. As you said, most conjoined twins, not at all, but most of them are going to be monozygotic twinning that didn't fully split. I think if we were to watch that process at the early stages, I think we'd get a glimpse, we'd get a sense of like which one was the original and which one was the offshoot that didn't develop the full repertoire of organs. I think if we watched it carefully, we'd be able to pick up empirically some of the cues for which one is sort of the one with the full repertoire of organs and which one has the smaller set. There are other empirical considerations in favor of this interpretation. So I've watched a lot of interviews, right? They had their own TV show, or the Hensel twins. So one of the things that always jumps out to me, and one of the things that always jumps out to my students when I show them these videos, is that they have clear cases, right, throughout their life. Now they're not a full dicephalus; they do have some of their own organs, right? They do double up some of the organs below the neck. But what's really interesting to me is they describe cases where a lot of times one of the twins is much warmer than the other. So one will say that the room is cold and the other one will say that the room is warm. And they say, right, that you can even tell like by touch, like you can touch the one's arm and you can sort of touch maybe the other one's arm, something like that, right? And one of them is much colder than the other. And indeed, right, they think that they described it one time as like you can even sort of like see like a line, like where the temperature sort of shifts, right? That would be sort of like where you could draw the line. Now, in that case, I think it's that in this case, right, it might be that neither twin has the full repertoire of organs, right? Because each one has sort of one arm, right, and one leg or something like that. It could be that one of the twins actually has all of them. But in terms of the control, one of them controls the limbs on the one side and one of them controls the limb on the other side. But the other thing that's really interesting is they have, throughout their lives, one of the twins, I'm forgetting which one, is often sick when the other one isn't. So the other one will be very, very sick with a cold or the flu, and the other one, in a way, is sort of just fine.
I never knew that. That's
Yeah.
new to me as well.
So you've got like, if you like the immunological way of distinguishing between organisms, right? It looks like we've got grounds for thinking that there are two animals there, right? If one can be sick and one isn't, right? Isn't that sort of suggestion, right? That we've actually got, they're connected, right? But we've got enough distinction between the immune systems, right? That's grounds for thinking that we've got two animals there. Now, as I said, right, I don't like the idea that there's just one animal. That doesn't seem right. I don't like the idea that they're overlapping. I like the idea that in some cases it's the organism is going to have the full, one of them is going to have the full repertoire and the other one just has the extras. Or in the Hensel twins case, it's sort of like neither one has the full repertoire, but one of them does seem to be in a way sort of like the stronger of the two as they describe their history, right? It seems like the one could survive detached from the other, but the other couldn't survive being detached from the first. And so maybe there's reason to think that one of them has sort of a larger set of the organs than the other. One indeed is on life support from the other. So these sort of considerations lead me to think that, no, I think there's still room, it's still possible, at least in principle, to distinguish there being two organisms there. Drawing the line in some cases might be difficult, but I don't want to say overlap and I don't want to say just one.
Yeah, so in this case, I'm guessing you will say that there's rather an epistemological ambiguity rather than the ontological ambiguity.
Yeah.
And this is
difficult to tell, but yeah,
yeah,
there's a fact of the matter. Yeah.
yeah, and this is also brought up by Alexandra Boyle in her paper, I think it was from 2020, where she sort of further goes deeper into the dicephalus cases, and she also brings up another case where the twins are sort of connected by their heads rather than their bodies, and she goes over the various different arguments as to, well, if we take this version of the body parts in the composition, then we still can end up with a single animal rather than two. It's sort of like, okay, well, are they connected by their neurological tissue? Are they connected by their nervous system? Are they connected by their bloodstream? Are they or do we take the real parts where they work as the benefit of the whole? And she says, well, in this case, it still appears that there is a single animal, and she sort of tries to really point out that there is an ontological ambiguity there, that really it's not that we can't tell that, well, there's really just a single animal, because we've kind of seem to fail to at least under the animalist presumption to tell whether we really have a single or two animals.
Yeah, her paper is really sharp because of the way in which it goes through the various sort of leading theories on how to individuate living organisms, and she argues that on all of these, right, it's plausible to suppose that we're dealing with just one animal. So the dicephalus cases, right, where they sort of share sort of body below the neck, and they have sort of two separate heads, two separate brains. The cephalopagus case is one in which sort of they're sort of two full bodies, but in a way they're connected at the head. A real life case that comes close to this are the Hogan twins. The Hogan twins are sort of, they have a neural bridge as it's described, right? Their two brains are connected, which gives them some really interesting powers, right? I've watched these videos, right? Where, right, in a way, sort of like information that the one gets through her senses can go across this neural bridge without having to go through the other person's senses. And sort of like they have access to, right, what the other person is seeing, even when it's not sort of through their own eyes. I could send you the videos on those. It's really wild.
Yeah,
But it raises the
absolutely.
question, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. It's it's super interesting. I've never
It
heard of
raises the question about like how joined would sort of two consciousnesses have to be before we start to wonder, right, whether there's really just one person there. What's puzzling about these cases is it seems like a living human organism could have extra organs, right? If something had three kidneys, right? Or I don't know, an extra liver, right? Or an extra lung or something like that, right? We wouldn't at all be inclined to think that, okay, well, it looks like there's another animal in the picture, right? So it looks like animals can in principle have extra organs, right? And so now what's tricky about these cases is, well, which organs that there are extra of, right, do we start to really wonder whether it's just sort of extra organs or whether we've actually got sort of a different living organism there. I mean, maybe a simple approach to this, as I said, if it turns out that the brainstem really is like this crucial organ for the life processes of an organism, then you count the number of organisms based on the number of brain stems. So in some dicephalus cases, you'd have two brain stems, so you could count the number of animals there. In the cephalopagus case, it looks like in most of the cases that they consider, we've got two brain stems. But when we don't have two brain stems, and that's going to be trickier. And I agree that there's a point at which, right, the unity between them is sort of so tight, we do start to wonder whether it's just one living organism with extra organs. Yeah. I mean, it's going to be tricky to figure out exactly where to draw the line. And some guys actually think sort of the dicephalus case might be easier than the cephalopagus case.
Yeah, I've seen it. She she kind of says that it's even worse when they're connected with their head
Yeah,
rather than the rest of the
yeah,
body.
yeah. I mean, it's important for the animalist to say, right, that there could be a living human organism without a cerebrum, without a higher part of the brain, because that's just the part of the brain that sort of controls the various capacities for consciousness. And if it's really sort of your basic life functions that are what make you and make you the same over time, then the loss of that, or sort of if you'd never developed it in the first place, wouldn't mean that we don't have a living human organism there. And so if there were in a way sort of like a shared cerebrum, or if there's just one cerebrum in the cephalopagus case, doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have one animal. The more interesting considerations are the ones that Boyle points out, right? About like, okay, now it's not just about the singular consciousness or the singular cerebrum there. It's actually more about the interaction sort of at the metabolic or immunological level. Yeah, these are tricky cases, right? in some ways, I want to start to take them case by case, as I said, right? I had some observations about the Hensel case that makes it much more clear to me that we can distinguish that there being two animals there. But they're definitely going to be trickier cases. I actually think sort of it would be wrong to think that we could have sort of a blanket statement that would cover all possible cases. You'd have to take them one by one to see what we have in front of us, right? And we have to know what things to look for. We're looking for number of brain stems, right? We're looking for, is there any immunological difference? We're looking for, right? Is it the case that if we took this part away, the animal would die, right? Or if we didn't take away this, if we took away this part, the animal would be just fine. So we have to sort of outline what the considerations are that we'd use to determine how many animals. But I'm not sure that we could have sort of a blanket approach, like in all cases like this, right? We're going, this is the answer. I think it's a bit more complex than that.
Okay, so I believe we covered the kind of probably the biggest objections
Yeah.
to pretty much any theory.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And you obviously seem to believe that every single one of those that you mentioned fails to account for all of
Yeah,
these problems.
yeah,
So I think it will be probably a good thing to start out with presenting what is your actual position, and
yeah,
how does your position account for all of the problems that we mentioned, and
yeah,
why is it superior to
yeah,
the other ones?
yeah. Good. So the view that I like, the one that I've written the most about, the one that I'm convinced is on the right track, that I think has lots of advantages over other views, is hylomorphism. Right? So hylomorphism most generally is a theory of material objects, which says that material objects are best understood as having these two key ingredients or components, both matter and form. Form is like the actualizing principle that takes the potentiality of the stuff, the matter, and makes it into a specific thing. So different forms will give us different types of material objects, even if they're made of the same general type of stuff. And as a theory of the human person, what it's saying is that persons also are best understood as composed of both matter and form. And in a way, sort of the matter of us, in a way, is our bodies, or whatever our bodies, in a way, are composed of. Though the deeper story might be one involving prime matter. And to speak of our form, right, is to speak of the complex organizing principle that not only sort of makes us in a way more than the sum of our parts, but also makes us a living thing and makes us the particular kind of living thing that we are, that makes us human. So, traditionally, Aristotle just designated the term soul for the complex form of any living thing, right? The thing that you need to add or do to the matter in order to compose a living thing, right? So some material objects are pretty simple, right? What's the form of a table or a chair? Well, it's just sort of the spatial arrangement of the parts. But living things are way more interesting than that. It's not just the spatial arrangement of the parts that makes it what it is. I mean, you could sort of like, you could glue the leaves, right, of a tree back to it, and you wouldn't in a way sort of have recomposed a tree. And indeed, as living things develop over time, the spatial arrangement of their parts is constantly changing. That's what it means for it to grow and to develop and to mature. So whatever the form, right, whatever is that extra thing besides the matter in the living thing that makes it what it is, has to be more complex than just the spatial arrangement. And so he designates a special term for whatever this sort of functional entity is that's sort of explaining the complexity and the development, right, the consistent development towards sort of particular trajectory of a living thing. He designates that with the term of soul. And in a way, that's all he means, is just the form of a living thing. So hylomorphism is a version of soul theory because it says that the deepest sort of explanation, right, for what human beings are and what makes us the same over time is this extra metaphysical thing sort of beyond the matter, this form, this formal principle, this actualizing principle. And so what hylomorphists will say, right, it is a further fact theory because it's going to say, right, well, there's various psychological facts about you and psychological continuity over time. And there are various sort of biological facts about your life processes and how they continue over time. But the deeper story, the thing that ultimately explains, right, this continuity that we see, the thing that holds all of your parts together, the thing that explains sort of why you have those particular capacities, and the thing that explains how your identity is sort of retained, even though you shuffle through all sorts of matter at a rapid rate, is this formal ingredient, this formal principle. Now, even though hylomorphism is a version of soul theory, it's you might say, a very grounded version of soul theory, right? Aristotle thought that we were animals. We are a particular kind of animal, right? We are rational animals. So right off the bat, a nice thing about hylomorphism is what it's they're trying to capture. One of the things I really like about hylomorphism is it's trying to capture sort of our animality. What it means is that we are sort of material things, in a way, down here in the muck with other living things. It explains our continuity in with other things in creation. It explains why our flourishing overlaps to a certain degree, right, with the flourishing of other things. We are animals like other animals, but it also trying to capture like the uniqueness, right, the specialness of the sort of animal that we are. We are, right, by nature, rational animals, which means that we have a developmental trajectory. We are the sort of thing that normally, when everything goes well, develops sort of like these high-level rational activities. Now, something can go wrong in development, but the fact that we'd recognize it as something going wrong, right, indicates, right, that we've got this developmental trajectory sort of built into the thing. And so that's to say that we're rational animals. So right off the bat, what I like about hylomorphism is that it is sort of a nice in-between view. It sort of captures sort of like what's unique and special about us that the psychological approaches are really trying to capture. There's things that we can do that other creatures cannot. Like there's something about our identity that's different than the identity of like raccoons and turnips, right? But it also really captures the nice advantage of animalism about sort of really capturing like, well, look, when I look in the mirror, right, I see myself, right? When I weigh myself on the scale, that's how much I weigh, right? That when you step on my foot, you step on me. I think hylomorphism is trying to capture both of those things. We are unique, sort of like there's something distinct about the kind of thing that we are, but we're also in a way sort of grounded. We are vulnerable in the way that other living things are. We are down here sort of in the physical world, right? Like other physical things are. So right off the bat, I think that's a nice thing that hylomorphism is trying to capture, both of those elements. It captures both in a way sort of the dignity of the human person, but also the vulnerability of the human person. On the psychological approach, you are only you, like when you're at the top of your game. And on animalism, like, well, you're you, right? So, and your sort of the fancy things that you can do, your psychology really has nothing to do with your identity. And hylomorphism is trying to like, no, right? I want to capture in a way sort of like both of the good parts about each of those theories.
Yeah, and so you did mention teleology, and there's a lot of like discussion on the,
Mhm.
well, are there natural kinds? Did
Yeah.
evolution like discount them all?
Mhm.
And then there are various views. Of course, people like Michael David or Christopher G. Austin have defended this. Michael David has a very recent published book, Biological Essentialism,
Mhm.
like 2 or 3 months ago, and Christopher G. Austin has his Essence in the Age of Evolution, which I think are wonderful books, and
Yeah.
anyone who's interested in this topic should definitely read them. I think they defend teleology and natural kinds extensively, and I think address pretty much all the necessary objections. Um, so that was a very precise and very good explanation of holomorphism. So I'm curious, how does holomorphism account for sort of all these problems that arise for, like, oh, there's problems for animalism, there's problems for the all other psychological views. So how does the in-between views sort of address all of those?
Good. So in general, right? So I think it has the advantage over psychological approaches, right? That it has a sort of clear answer to what is the relationship between you and the animal in your chair. On hylomorphism, well, you're it. For hylomorphism, the deeper story about organisms is one involving matter and form, body and soul, but it's still the case that the thing sitting in the chair is me. The thing I see in the mirror is me. Psychological approaches, right, they have to explain sort of like, well, okay, I don't think it's actually you, like you're part of it, or it's part of you, or you're like the software realized on the hardware of the animal. Nice thing about hylomorphism versus psychological approach is that it captures with animalism sort of like the common sense, sort of straightforward answer, right, to what's the relationship between you and the animal. I'm just it. Um, but the fact that it's a further fact, it's got a deeper explanation for what makes the animal that you are, and indeed any animal, right, the same over time, has to do with this formal element, something that's like this extra metaphysical part that's in some way underneath and explains the various kinds of psychological and biological continuity that we see. That further fact is what helps it to solve like these fission cases. I think all these other views, psychological and biological, as I've tried to argue, right, they all face versions of these fission or double transplant cases. It seems possible that your biological continuity, your psychological continuity could be continued twice over, and then what the heck happens to you? On hylomorphism, right? The deeper story is about your form. And if we think that forms are like these additional metaphysical components that also can't be split, or there can't be sort of more or less, or there can't be some of the form here and some of the form there. If we accept that thing about forms, which I think we should, but that would require a different sort of argument. If that's true, that forms are like simple and can't be split or doubled up, then you've got this extra ingredient, you've got this tiebreaker in the case of fission. And so it borrows the benefit of further fact theories of being able to provide a tiebreaker for these fission and double transplant cases. So I think it captures from animalism sort of the basic common sense approach to what's the relationship between us and the animal. It captures something of the psychological approach because it says there is something special about the type of animal that we are, even if we aren't always sort of exercising our rationality. We are the sorts of creatures that normally naturally develop those abilities, which is decidedly different, right, than a dog. And the further fact allows it to solve, or at least give an extra move towards solving fission cases. I think it's, I mean, another reason to think that it might do better than some of these other views are like problems of indeterminacy or vagueness. So if what makes you the same over time is some sort of physical, some sort of causal continuity between your mental states, or that you retain enough of the mental states as you did before, or if what makes you the same over time is the continuity of these life functions. It seems like to me like there's always going to be a question that once you accept a reductionist theory of the human person, one that says that your identity is really just explained, is just constituted by these other facts, either the biological continuity or the psychological continuity. Once you reduce personal identity to that, then there's the worry about like, okay, well, how much biological continuity is enough? How much psychological continuity is enough to keep you going? Imagine it's sort of a spectrum, right? It's sort of like your psychology sort of wanes, right? Or imagine that sort of like your life functions sort of cut out one by one. The question is like sort of at what point can we say that the human person has ceased to exist? The larger worry is that whatever answer you gave to when there's too much of the psychology gone to be the original person, or too much of the life functions to say that we still have the same living animal there, the worry is that whatever answer you give is going to be arbitrary, right? It's just going to sort of like, here's where we draw the line. And the worry is that like, well, why right there and why not earlier? And I start to wonder whether this is a fact in the world, or whether we're just sort of stipulating that this is the point at which we don't have enough continuity anymore. The nice thing about hylomorphism, the nice thing about further fact theories in general, right, is if there's this extra ingredient that makes you who you are, and it can't be divided, or it doesn't have parts, or it can't be more or less, then there's going to be a hard line in any situation when you exist and at what point you don't. And once again, it might be very difficult to tell exactly when the form is no longer there. But if forms can't be more or less, if they can't be part of the form or less of the form, then there's going to be a precise metaphysical answer in every case when you exist and when you don't. And that seems to capture, like, when I reflect on sort of my own future, when I think about what various things could happen to me, and I wonder whether, right, will I be the person that wakes up after that procedure, or will I survive this, right? When I think about like possibility of an afterlife, I think about, well, will that be me? It seems like there ought to be a determinate answer. It seems like there ought not be just a vague answer. Well, it's got a bit of you, or it's partly you, or it's you to a certain degree. A lot of cases that matter most to me, right? Speaking of it as a matter of degree, or as sort of like an indeterminate, giving an indeterminate answer just seems like the wrong answer. It seems to me that, look, either I'm going to survive it or I won't. Either I'm going to wake up sort of on that sort of hospital bed, or I'm not, right? Either right, it's going to be me, or it's going to be someone else, or it's going to be no one. It seems like there ought to be, I sort of the strong inclination that not everybody I've learned sort of shares this inclination that in these cases that most matter to me, right, it seems like there ought to be a determinate answer. And if these other views can't give us a determinate answer, and further fact theories can, I think that's a point in favor of these further fact theories. So there's another point in favor of hylomorphism. Now, what I would just say is, the way that the debate about the ontology of the person goes, right, it's rare that we get sort of a knockdown argument, right, that says that this view can't possibly work. Every now and then we get one, right? But most it's about sort of like weighing the costs and benefits of various views. What we're engaged in here is a kind of inference to the best explanation. We're trying to figure out which theory of the human person best captures what other things we know to be the case, best captures our experience and what we know from the empirical sciences. And so you start like adding costs of various views, and you add up the benefits of the various views. And so my project and sort of where I'm at now is I see a lot of benefits to hylomorphism, and I see how we can get around a lot of the problems that face other views. Now, bringing in souls, right, is going to introduce lots of other problems, right? But it looks like it has a lot going for it, and there are some other problems for the other views, like the fission case, that I honestly just don't know. I don't know if they have sort of a good enough response that's going to be better than what the further fact theory can say.
Yeah, and there's also the sort of some reductionist responses where, okay, well, what if we take and destroy the rest of your body, but leave just the brain, and if we can put them into these machines, and then suddenly you now are in this machine, and so some animals might say, well, you are the brain stem. Some people who endorse the brain views will say, well, you are your brain now. So how would holomorphists say that you are your brain in this case, or would they say something else?
That's a really good question. And hylomorphists are divided on this issue, no pun intended, right? There are some hylomorphists who think, right, that, well, we should say the same thing about sort of these brain transplant cases or these more complicated cases as the animalist would, right? If you're a human animal, if you're a rational animal, then focus on the animality part, and wherever sort of like if your life functions are continuing, then that's where you are. So the hylomorphist has the option to just sort of really emphasize the animality part of its account of our identity over time. Other hylomorphists sort of, and I've explored this idea about whether hylomorphists should say, maybe they should emphasize the rational part. That we are right now sort of animals, the whole thing. But maybe even more important than where sort of like our life functions go, maybe even more important, right, is where our rational capacities go. So in hylomorphism, you need not always be able to sort of exercise your rationality. But if someone were to move like the part of your brain in a way sort of like that seems to be the major tool or instrument you have for exercising your rationality, if someone were to move that to a different body, is that reason to think that your form, your rational soul, has also gone with it? That's an interesting question. And I've sort of gone back and forth on this. If they go that way, then they are going to capture a lot of the reactions that most of us have to thinking that, oh yeah, that is the most important part of me. If you move that, right, then I go with it. But then you're also going to have these puzzles, once again, about what if we split the brain? I mean, the nice thing about hylomorphism is that it has an answer to the split brain cases. So it could say that you go with your cerebrum, the part of your brain that's sort of in a way carrying or that's most operating when you engage in rational activities. But also if you split it, it could also have an account of how it could say, well, even if you split it, right, your form or your soul might go in one of the offshoots rather than the other. So it could maybe get sort of like the best of both worlds, what we really want out of this account. I'm not sure that the hylomorphists should say that, but as I said, it depends on whether they want to emphasize the rationality of the rational animal definition, or if they want to emphasize the animality of the rational animal definition. I mean, one of the lessons here is that hylomorphism has a lot of resources to solve these problems in a way, sort of like whichever way it goes.
Yeah, so I guess if they partook in the rational side, you could still account for. I mean, I think I believe in other case you could, but you could account for the early embryo, even though it's doesn't have the brain that sort of gives its rational ability. Still has the capacity, which sort of at the point of destroying the body and placing the brain, it sort of moves into the whole brain, and then sort of ends up in this other place. So I think that would be like, at least from the Thomistic holomorphic perspective, would be like a good way to address it.
I think that one's definitely on the table. Yeah.
So for the other, how do you think the holomorphic sense would account for the conjoined twinning and
Oh yeah,
all the other cases? So like
yeah.
David Hirshenov, which I'm also going to have on the channel,
Oh, cool.
and I think early October or something.
Yeah,
He because he wrote like I think he wrote two papers on this. So he also kind of responds to it in the first paper. He sort of says, well, the 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 embryo is sort of endowed with two rational souls, which sort of extent. I'm not a huge fan of that response, to be honest. It kind of seems like, okay, well, can another substance be a proper part? It
right. Yeah,
kind of messes up there. But he has a more recent paper. I haven't I don't I read it, but I don't remember it quite correctly.
uh-huh.
So, what would be your response to this in this case?
Yeah. So I mean, do you mean to talk about like the conjoined twins, like, or do you mean sort of like twinning, sort of at the early stages?
Uh, Well, I mean, I guess I think we could start with the twinning in the early stages, then we can
Yeah.
go into
Yeah,
the
sure.
conjoined
Yeah,
twinning.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. So I got an article coming out on monozygotic twinning and what to say about these cases. Um, and one of the things I do in the paper is try to really sketch out like every option I could possibly think of for what happens, right? So in the case of monozygotic twinning, right, we've got a single human zygote, or later on, sort of a single human embryo, which divides into two, right? And indeed, right, you could even have more than that. It could divide into three, or it could divide again later on. You could have like four, right? You could have a very complicated situation. But the standard one, we
Or
get a
even the fusion case where
yes, yeah,
there's
yeah, exactly.
the
It
fusion
could
of the
be sort
embryos.
of, we could have sort of dizygotic fusion, right? You could have sort of two, right, zygotes that actually later on fuse. Fusion is a whole other sort of thing. But in the case of monozygotic twinning, right, we had a couple different options, right? So if you want to say, right, that the zygote is a thing, maybe even you want to say it's a living human organism, I'm inclined to go that route. Um, so if you want to say that, then what happens to it in a case of monozygotic twinning? Looks like we had a couple different options. One option is to say that the original ceases to exist, that maybe like an amoeba splits, right, is actually a way sort of like of it reproducing while also sort of passing away. Maybe what happens in monozygotic twinning is that the original zygote, if it's a living human organism, then an original human organism ceases to exist in an interesting way, right? And we've got two brand new living human organisms on the scene. Or it could be, right, that one of them is the original and one of them is new, or the other. Or it could be, right, that some have tried to make work in a way sort of like that both of the offshoots are indeed the original, right? And there's sort of wacky ways in which you could sort of try to uphold that. Though it seems silly, right, when you actually sort of meet identical twins and say, oh yeah, really, you're really just one. You know that, right? That would be a very strange thing to say to someone. Um, or one of the other ways to try to do it, I think this is the one that you were referring to, is you could try to say that, well, wait a second here, the one single zygote, I think it's wrong to speak of it as just one thing. Maybe prior to that, what we've got, right, we've got like two organisms packed in there from the start, or at least two persons, if not living human organisms, and they just sort of like get their own rooms, right, when the twinning happens, right? They sort of finally, one of them, in a way, sort of finally moves out, right? Even though they were there all along. I don't like the route of saying that there are two there all along, mostly because we still don't know exactly why twinning occurs, but we do know, right, that in some cases it is environmentally induced. In other words, like why it happens is because certain environmental conditions, right, and in the womb. And so if that's true, if at least can be triggered by environmental conditions, like what if, in a way, sort of like if it's dependent on the environmental conditions, I don't see how they could be both packed in there right from the get-go, right? It would have to be, the only way it could work that they're packed in there from the get-go is for sure they're going to split later on. But we don't have any reason to believe, and in fact, I think we have good reason to believe that this is false, that things are, that the ones that are going to split are set up to split from the beginning. It seems actually highly conditional, right? It seems to matter on the environment whether they split or not. So if the environmental conditions like changed and it didn't split, then the double up view would have this weird implication that like, okay, then I guess we still have two persons sort of in that one body, which would be a very curious result. So I don't like that route unless they can solve that problem. Um, I don't like the route that says that the original zygote, if it's a living human organism, passed away and we've got two brand new things, because we get curious results. And then that would mean there's sort of like every woman who has identical twins, you should say, right, both congratulations and condolences, right? You should say congratulations on the two. I'm sorry about the one that you lost in order to get those two.
And they
right?
really, and then in that case, they were not really her kids. She didn't really create them.
Yeah.
She only created the
Yes.
first one.
Yes.
So
Yeah. The
it's
other weird part of that is it
very,
turned out, yeah, that both of the twins are actually, in some sense, her grandchildren. Because the first one was her child, and the way the other two were like asexually reproduced off of the one. So the option that I like is the one where one of the offshoots is the original and the other is not. I call this the budding option because it's almost like, to sort of speak like sort of brutally biological, that one in a way sort of buds off the other, like in some other species besides human beings, right? That you can have that. And so like the one is the original, and then what happens, right, is that the one in a way sort of branches off. It's going to mean that the one is younger, at least by several days, right, than the other. Okay. Nothing died. And so, right, it does mean that at least one of them began to exist right from the get-go. It's still going to have the curious result that, strictly speaking, one of the twins is in a way the clone of the other, and almost like the offspring of the other. Now, unless we saw that happen, we were never going to know which one is the original. You can sort of imagine the identical twins sort of debating with one another. Wait a second, who's the adult in the room, right? Who's really sort of the parent here? Wouldn't be any way to know. But strictly speaking, the one really kind of like the parent of the other, in a way. So I think we're going to get weird results, whatever we say about monozygotic twinning. But I like the budding option. Now, some people think that I have argued that, well, complications around monozygotic twinning means that for sure it'd be impossible to say that a living human organism begins to exist at conception. It's almost like it's a logical mistake to say that the human being begins to exist at conception. And one of the things that I'm trying to argue against is that, well, it's not a logical impossibility. There's going to be something weird that happens in monozygotic twinning. Either the original died, or one of them is older and is like the parent of the other, or it's going to turn out that there were two there all along. But none of those are sort of logically excluded. They all have some sort of weirdness attached to them. But to say that sort of like there's no way that the human organism began to exist at conception, that's far too strong. The real question is sort of like, look at the empirical details, learn as much as we can, and sort through the different options to try to figure out, well, what's the most plausible suggestion? There are a bunch that are possible and definitely logically possible, empirically possible. As I said, they all have some weirdness attached to them, but it's perfectly consistent. It's perfectly plausible to suggest that human organisms begin to exist in conception, or at least the phenomenon of monozygotic twinning doesn't get in the way. It means we got to say something weird, but it doesn't mean that human organisms don't begin to exist. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the kind of responses I've seen to that is, well, what in the cases of symmetric monozygotic twinning, where sort of the embryos or the zygotes look identical to each other, there's really there's no difference there. So kind of, okay, well, there's no reason to say, well, this one is the original one as opposed to the other one. But I don't see that as a very good objection. It seems kind of, again, what I said earlier, the epistemological ambiguity rather than the actual.
Yeah. And you know what I'm going to say about that case, right? Because I'm going to bring in that further fact. Right? If there's a form, right, or a soul or something there, then there will be a tiebreaker for what makes the original, is that it has sort of the former soul that's been there from the beginning. And the other one sort of has a new former soul that sort of is introduced, right, at the moment of splitting. So there is going to be a tiebreaker, right? If you also accept something like a further fact, like a hylomorphic sort of view, there's another point in favor of hylomorphism.
So how would the hylomorphism account for the cases of conjoined twinning, where we have Dicephalus and
good. Yeah. So here too, I think the hylomorphist has options. As I said, they can emphasize the animality portion of it, and so they can piggyback, or they can just sort of repeat some of the animalist strategies for doing it, right? I don't think that the hylomorphist is going to like at all the option that there's just one animal there. So I don't think that animalist option is one they're going to like. Because if we're rational animals, we've got, like, it seems like 2 intellects and 2 wills. It seems anyway. So they're going to be strongly disinclined to accept that there's just one animal there. So maybe there are other sort of like biological considerations that would allow us to say that there are two animals there. Or hylomorphism could emphasize the rational part of the rational animality. If we've got two centers of rationality, then that's reason right there. That's reason to think that we've got two rational animals. And so then that's reason to think that there's some way, right, of dividing the parts of there's a fact of the matter where which of the parts belong to which rational animal. So it could emphasize the rationality part, or it could look for sort of the biological answers to how we distinguish between the twins. So once again, it has a lot of resources. I'm not sure that hylomorphism has like a unique answer to it, but it's a versatile theory. It has various resources, various options for what it could say about them. I'm not sure that it has sort of like a brand new novel solution, but maybe it does. I think that it's just going to go one of those two ways. It's going to look for some biological ways of distinguishing between the twins, or it's really just going to emphasize, look, we've got two spheres of rationality, we've got two intellects and two wills, and so if each of us is a rational animal, it looks like we got two of those here.
Yeah, so it would be kind of like there's two distinctive developmental pathways that are undergoing for
Good.
the end
Good.
goal of rational faculties.
Good. I mean, you could do that, right? I mean, because however the conjoined twins happen, whether it was an incomplete split or whether it was kind of fusion, historically, yeah, you could trace the developmental trajectories, right? You could say the developmental pathways. You could see in a way, so the way in which they collided, or in ways which they never sort of fully separated, but you could still sort of see how there's like two, in a way, things developing there. So I guess if you're brought in the teleological aspect, right, of hylomorphism, then yes, it does have that additional resource. So that's true.
Yeah, so I think this addresses both the Dicephalus case and the other one. I sort of forget what it's called, but
The cephalopagus one?
yeah.
Yeah.
Although in that case, some people might argue that there's only a single consciousness. It's kind of
In some cases, yeah, it almost seems like that. Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so, but once again, importantly on hylomorphism, right, you don't have to be, in a way, sort of exercising that rationality in order to be a rational animal. You could be, in a way, sort of an impaired rational animal. And what we may have in a cephalopagus case is one of them is severely impaired, doesn't have the cerebral cortex to be able to exercise its rational abilities, right? Is more like sort of like a patient, almost like in a persistent vegetative state, something like that.
So as we're bringing to a close,
Okay.
I would like to ask you what do you think is the what's the kind of the biggest objection to the holomorphic view
Yeah.
at this point?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, the biggest objection or the biggest count against hylomorphism is the one that people are going to be nervous about right from the start. Hylomorphism, as a further fact, as a sole theory, requires a commitment to this extra sort of undetectable element, right? It's positing the existence of something non-physical or immaterial. The nice thing about those other approaches, right, is they don't sort of have this extra kind of thing in their ontology. And anytime you bring in an extra thing in your ontology, right? I mean, Occam's razor is just waiting there, right, to sort of you sort of slice it down, right? You've got to have, right, these advantages of hylomorphism had better be so good, right, that they can really sort of motivate us to posit the existence of this thing, right, that isn't directly empirically detectable, right? So that I think that sort of the biggest worry about it, right, is just trying to motivate the idea, right, that there's this extra thing in the world, there's this extra entity that we can't directly detect. So we've got to provide some really good reasons for thinking that it's there. Anytime you're adding a new kind of thing to your ontology, you bear the burden of proof of showing that it's necessary in order to explain something. And so I think that's the biggest task for hylomorphism, especially because hylomorphism is this big complex theory of the world. Like it's got a lot of baggage in the sense of like it's got a lot of commitments, right? As you said, it's committed to a kind of teleology. It's committed to like these four types of causes. It's committed to like a distinction between substance and artifacts. It's committed to, I didn't even really talk about this, but it's committed to a kind of substantial holism where sort of like the parts are ontologically derivative of the whole. Hylomorphism is a loaded, right? It's like you're having to put a lot of extra rocks into your backpack, right, to carry with you. And so the real task of hylomorphism is to motivate, is to justify taking on all those additional commitments. And so you really have to have good arguments, and you really have to respond to all the other worries for the other views. Because if the other views can get around those worries without having to bring in all this stuff, they win, right? We should prefer the simpler theory. So hylomorphism has the task of just asking us for some pretty strong other commitments, and so it's got to have pretty good arguments to do that.
Yeah, that's of course if views like physicalism is able to account for all the mind-body problems, which I don't think it is. And I had Dvorsky talk about
Yeah,
those, and Kuhn's
yeah.
also has a book on the waning of materialism,
Mhm,
which
mhm.
he also goes over this. And I
Yeah.
truly believe that holomorphism is superior to all those. But do you think that maybe the sort of the objections from the soul can be discounted by adopting more like a
Mm,
modern to holomorphism, like Anna
mm,
Marmodoro invoking
mm.
powers, and
Mm.
Robert Kuhn's doing his thing as well? Because there are William Simpson uh,
Mhm,
recently published the book Holomorphism, where he goes over the various theories from Anna Kostetsky, Mark Luria, um, and he kind of puts them in this category of either kind of powerist holomorphism
mhm. Yeah, yeah.
and the sort of the structural or conceptual holomorphism, where they are the forms are this kind of rather just dependent on the mind, or are they just these real concrete things that have causal powers, or are powers themselves?
Yes.
Do you think that
Yes.
that's a kind of way that we can like sidestep the problem of invoking this soul?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's sidestepping it, right? But I mean, one of the great advantages for the hylomorphists, right, in sort of like the current environment is that Aristotelian approaches to various issues in metaphysics, right, are getting a lot of attention. They're getting increased sort of attention. They've been taken a lot more seriously, right? Even like cutting edge, like philosophy of physics or philosophy of biology, are taking very seriously like these Aristotelian notions of form and matter, these Aristotelian notions of teleology. And so you're right that in the present context, arguing for those additional commitments is easier than it has been in quite a while, right?
Yeah.
Because you've already got sympathy for this sort of like this notion of powers, right? This notion of directionality, this notion of like even like the substantial holism stuff is sort of making a comeback. So you're right that in the current context, it's going to be much easier. It's not sidestepping it, but it's in a way sort of like a much friendlier sort of environment to be able to sort of pitch these ideas. And sort of like the time is ripe, right, to really sort of spell out as best as we can the commitment to hylomorphism in a way sort of like the audience hasn't been friendlier than this in quite some time.
Yeah, it quite excites me what's gonna come next.
Mhm.
Speaking of which, do you have any upcoming projects? Anything new coming out? That I read your most recent paper on the recycle reuse.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah. So
Quite a
that paper
paper.
that Yeah, so that paper that's coming out is the one where I sort of argue for how hylomorphism has an advantage over animalism, that it can get around these fission cases and can solve problems about vagueness or indeterminacy. One of the other big projects I'm working on is this question about what is a form, right? What is the best way to understand a form? And you've already hinted at there are like powers approaches and there are like structure approaches to understanding forms. I've been working on this project for a while where I think the best way to understand what a form is, the most plausible version of hylomorphism is one that takes forms to be activities. Bill Jaworski has sort of like moved in this direction. I think that's the right way to go, to think about forms as a kind of activity, or sometimes I use the language of like process. So that's a loaded term, right? Given the history of process philosophy, right? So I think so. I'm working on this project to spell out. I don't think structure is the right way to think about it. I'm not sure that powers is the right way to think about it. What if we thought of forms as activities, right? Is this like a more plausible version, and is going to be more plausible for people who are nervous about this extra element. So speaking of activity is actually going to be one in which sort of when they really read what hylomorphism is saying, if we understand an activity, oh, that doesn't sound sort of nearly as spooky, right? Or as sort of wild as I thought. You're just sort of have like a really interesting ontology of the world, according to which, right, it's sort of like matter and these certain like substantial activities that explain sort of the things that we see in front of us.
Yeah,
So
I'm
that's the
glad.
project I'm working on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad that all the recent literature is sort of moving in that direction, as viewing the form, and not as this static,
Yeah, right.
unmovable,
Right.
fully lacking of causal powers, but rather
Right.
this actual activity. It's really making me excited for what's to come. So
All right, cool.
I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for joining me today. It was a wonderful discussion. We went over pretty much all the most prominent objections there
Yes.
are to pretty much any personal identity theory. We covered all of them in great detail. I hope that I can have you sometime in the future in some other projects. I would love to hear from you again. So for the audience, thank you very much for joining me today. And I will see you in the next video.
All right. Thanks so much, Ivan.